Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Day 3 of South by Southwest EDU 2015. My name is Rachel Thompson, and I'm a senior at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm studying secondary English education. And I've also had the pleasure of interning with South by Southwest EDU this festival season. This morning, I have the honor of introducing 4 very passionate voices who are leading the conversation about the future of the student voice in higher education. As a university student myself, I greatly appreciate the way these colleagues of mine are advocating for increased student representation in the university's decision-making process. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jill Barshay, Alicia Fredriksen, Zach Malamud, and Dale Stevens.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Is my mic on? I think I hear it. So I'm Jill Barshay. I am a contributing editor at the Hechinger Report, which is a nonprofit education news service. We cover inequality and innovation in education. And what that means is I write a weekly column called Education by the Numbers, and I edit colleagues' work. When I was first asked by Minerva, which is a brand new university that just set up this year, to moderate a panel on student-directed or student-built higher education, I was confused and intrigued and skeptical. We'll get to the skeptical part in the Q&A, which I hope you'll all ask lots of questions. I was confused because in education circles, these terms are bandied around a lot. Student-centered learning, student-directed learning, student-built learning, and a lot of people mean a lot of different things by it. So I'm quite curious to hear what our panelists think. And I'm also intrigued that there was so much interest in this. This particular panel was one that was, I think, proposed last summer, and people who were going to come to this conference voted on making this a featured panel. And these ideas have been around for a while. I personally went to a university where you could design your own major and design your own classes, and they started that in 1969. So I'm curious why there's a lot of new enthusiasm about this idea about student-directed learning. We have 3 people representing 3 very different perspectives or having 3 very different experiences with student-directed learning. I'd like to start with our most extreme example, who is Dale Stevens. He claims he dropped out of school after 5th grade, which I think is illegal. And he started an organization called Uncollege. And its purpose is to help students structure their off year, which I thought was, something unstructured. And he also wrote a book a couple years ago, and I want to get the title of this right. It is called Hacking Your Education, Ditch the Lectures, Save Tens of Thousands, and Learn More Than Your Peers Ever Will. And he's also one of the very first Thiel Fellows. Peter Thiel, you might know, was the founder of PayPal and the first investor in Facebook. And now Mr. Thiel gives Mr. Stevens $50,000 a year for being Dale.
Did. That was just for 2 years.
Just 2 years?
Yeah.
Oh, it's done now?
Yeah, so they're 2-year rotations.
Oh, okay, well, the money's probably spent by now. So my first question for Dale is, what does it mean to you to have students building their own education?
I've been outside the school system for a long time, as Jill said, and what we think about when we think about student-centered education is really wanting students to get at the heart of why they're doing what they're doing, and so that they can build the right skill set and toolkit so they don't necessarily have to go and spend 50 grand at a 4-year university and spend 4 years of their life before being ready to enter the workforce. And we explicitly teach the kinds of skills that you should learn in school, but schools never bother to actually teach. So our curriculum is all around creation, curiosity, and self-advocacy. The skills we teach are things like how do you negotiate, communicate, keep yourself motivated, evaluate yourself. If you do college correctly, you may learn these skills. But that's if you show up, go to office hours, do everything above and beyond what's expected of you, right? rarely do we ever sit down and explicitly say, you're doing this book report on a separate piece because we want you to learn how to think critically, how to represent someone else's perspective, and all of these things that are actually really important and you do every day for the rest of your life. But we assume that people are smart enough when they're 18 to figure these things out. And I wish that someone had told me that these meta skills were actually really what was important. Because if you can learn how to learn, you can teach yourself everything else.
To be clear to the audience, do you believe in learning not at a formal university, that it's better to learn outside the formal institution?
Everyone learns best in different levels of structure, right? I think most people use university as a forcing function to make themselves get up in the morning, go to class, and do work. And if that's what you need to motivate yourself, great. But I think that there are cheaper and more effective ways to learn if you are willing to be self-reflective and keep yourself accountable to what needs to get done.
So to make it clear to our audience, how cheaply can you get a better BA?
I mean, if the program that we offer is a quarter of the price and a quarter of the time and 1/10 of the price of a four-year university. It's 15 grand for the year. It includes 6 months of housing. But if you're equipped to do it on your own, we encourage you to do it on your own. We provide free resources so that you can do it on your own. Not everyone wants to, and there is value in a community, which is why we run programs. But I know lots of people who have decided to take it upon themselves to learn, to get a job, to get themselves to a place where they can continue to reflect on what they're doing, to iterate on their learning process, and essentially can get themselves an entry-level job and get paid to learn, as opposed to paying to learn.
That's very clever if you can get paid to learn, which you did in your Teal Fellowship. The next panelist I have is Zach Malamud. He is a junior at the University of Maryland, where he designed his own major. It's something called engagement and media. Might ask him what that means. He's also the founder of an advocacy group called Student Voice, and I think they're in the process of developing a Bill of Rights for students. Mm-hmm. And my question for you, I mean, you're working within the traditional system, not outside of universities. What does student-built or student-directed learning mean to you?
Well, from a personal experience standpoint, I created my own major after coming into the university as a government and politics major, realizing that the direction that they were putting me in through that major was too confining and wasn't really opening me up to the perspectives that I wanted to have. I really valued the interdisciplinary approach that creating a major really offered me. So I went through a few iterations of creating my own major. First it was education policy, then it was social engagement, and then it ended up being engagement in media. And I learned a lot about myself through that process. And actually, currently, as much as I am a degree-seeking student at the University of Maryland, College Park, I am also a part-time student at NYU while being a part-time student at Maryland this year, because New York is really the place where, or the best place for me to study media. So I think that the fact that I've been able to craft my own experience, both based on location, coursework, and really experiences too, because independent studies are a central component of my learning experience, that really is a student-built, student-created learning experience, and something that I value, and it gives me purpose and creates relevancy in my education that I didn't feel like I had when I was a government and politics major. As much as I'm interested in the field, it wasn't my only interest, and at times some of the courses within the major lacked relevancy in my opinion, and therefore I really didn't feel a purpose being in the class. Now this is the first semester since probably being in maybe, I don't know, 7th grade, that I can say I actually enjoy every single class I'm taking. I actually want to go to school, and I'm upset this week that I'm at South by Southwest and not in class. As much as I love being here, it's great to love what you're learning. And being able to create your own learning experience within a structured environment and a traditional environment is something I value. I understand it's not for everybody, but at the same time, Jill, you brought up the fact that since the 1960s, there was this opportunity to create your own major at universities. At my university, there are about 25 kids who are creating their own major, and they have to seek out this opportunity. It's not something that's widely promoted, and I think that is something that, it shows that the system hasn't really fully embraced the opportunity to create and design your own learning experience. And in part, I mean, just to tie it into my work with Student Voice, I think it's because students aren't necessarily at the center of the school improvement process. Students aren't necessarily a part of every conversation about what can make the university better. And if students were all aware of the fact that they could actually create their own major, I think you'd see more students pursuing that. Most students at Maryland don't find out about this opportunity until they're like juniors or seniors, and that's too late. I was lucky enough to meet a senior who encouraged me to do it when I was a freshman. And so that really shaped my 4 years, and I value it, and I think it made my 4 years much more worthwhile.
I mean, if you, as someone who's super self-directed and super motivated, had mediocre classes for the last 9 years, that means there's a huge problem with the system.
Well, you know, part of why I actually created my own major, and this is something you'll appreciate in media and engagement, is because of my experience with Student Voice. Student Voice started really just with a hashtag on Twitter. And so I like the idea of complementing my real-world experiences with the in-the-classroom opportunities that I have, because especially in New York, you have professors that are working in the field day after day, and to have that, as much as I'm paying for it, that opportunity that I really, you know, wouldn't have had otherwise had I been pursuing a major that didn't feel as relevant, it would have deterred from the whole experience. So I like that those complementing factors a lot.
Right, and our final panelist, Alicia Fredriksen. I'm really excited to have her on the panel. She is actually shaping her university and kind of helping to build it from scratch. It's called Minerva. For those of you who've read press about Minerva, it's getting a reputation, or it's sort of initially pitched itself as an online Ivy League university at half the cost. I think they're trying to get away from that moniker now. But the idea is they live together in a dorm, but they take all their classes online. Alicia is one of the first crop of students at the very first year at Minerva. And I'm fascinated with her personally. She's a true global citizen. She went to high school in India. Her folks live in Sweden, and the first time I met her was Skyping to her in Stockholm, I think it was. And she claims she's Canadian, and here she is in Austin, Texas. So please tell us how student input works at Minerva and how students are actually shaping the university.
Sure. So yeah, I think to add on to the background a little bit. So around this time last year, I was studying in India. And I was desperately waiting to hear back from universities, just like all of my other friends there. But I wasn't feeling too good about this process because I felt like the traditional university admission system was this massive, unfair lottery, and I felt like I had no chance of winning. So I didn't have legacy, I don't have much money. I do come from a number of countries, but they're not exotic, underrepresented countries. And just to clarify that piece a little bit, I think if you look at one of the top schools, they might say that they have 70 countries represented, but those students will actually be 10% of the school population. So while that definitely benefits the institution and the reputation, it really doesn't benefit the students that don't come from the exotic countries. So that's just one way that currently isn't student-centric. But then there was this new school called Minerva that didn't have these international student quotas, didn't have legacy, all these other components, and I felt like Minerva actually saw me and recognized my potential and my capabilities, and then sort of picked me up out of this system and said that they really wanted to help me develop this potential. So I started to learn more about Minerva to figure out if it would be a good match for me. And I think I realized that Minerva really values a lot of the principles that I value, and I felt like it was almost like the school version of the person that I wanted to become. And it was also the opportunity to actually shape my education and the education of students after me. So that was really why I decided to take this leap of faith to join a new university and to become a member of the founding class, because I felt like it was a school that I valued, but also a school that valued me. So I think to make a quick distinction, it really isn't, student-directed for us doesn't mean that it's entirely built by students alone. It really means that it's entirely built with the students in the center, but we're very much supported by our faculty and staff. So I think if I could change the title of this panel a little bit, it would be not built by students for students, but built with students for students, or built by students, staff, and faculty for students. But everything is really with the students in the center, and I think that's the important piece. And that's the piece that's also quite crazy to me, and I think quite unusual from just building your own major, which might be an option elsewhere. It's that every member of the Minerva community has this common long-term goal in mind, and everyone was really working to prepare students for personal and professional success. And that is really the core of everything that we do. And this is manifested in every element of Minerva. So if you look at the curriculum, it's directly benefiting students both short and long term by teaching us first how to think, and doing this in a way that we can actually remember, because it's based off of the science of learning, and in a way that we can actually apply to any context. And then if you look at our classroom experience, so we don't have a campus, but we take our classes on these online active learning seminars, which are small seminars with maximum 19 students and a professor. And every single student participates in every class, and every single student gets feedback after every class as well. So it's very personalized and very progressive. And then we also have these global experiences, so we're a truly global university. And I'll zoom in on this as an example as well of where we've helped to shape it. So before I came to Minerva, they told me that I'd be going to 7 cities over the course of my degree, which was very exciting. And they were pretty amazing cities, so places like Hong Kong, Mumbai, London, New York. And they definitely made a lot of sense for people to experience, but they didn't make the most sense for students. And I think student-centric for us really means that we get to ask why. So in this case, we started asking, like, why is there no African city included? Or why do we start and end in the US? Why are the cities so expensive? And that's kind of what opened up this dialogue and this process, which is generally how it'll work. We'll start to ask questions, but then there's a process and this conversation that we have with our staff and with our faculty. And now we're in the midst of actually refining this roadmap a little bit. And the students in San Francisco last night were just sending us all these surveys so we could try to reach a consensus. So that's kind of one of the more exciting examples. But then one really concrete example as well is if you imagine any class that you've ever been to, and at the end of the class before you leave, the professor says, I just want to get your thoughts on how that class went. So was there anything that you wanted to understand better? Was there something that confused you? Was there something that I could have done better? Not the kind of thing that your teacher will ask you before you leave, but this is something that happens for us after every class, every single day. And it's a very quick but very critical element of how we actually make sure that what we've done in the past helps us to do something better in the future. So each class is a way to improve the next class. And I think this is definitely very important for the founding class students, these city discussions and post-class surveys, but it's also something that's true of any Minerva student in any year. And so I think what's really important is that to be a Minerva student, it really means to be careful and curious and critical about your education. It means to develop these personal relationships with your peers and your staff and your faculty, and it means to always be asking questions about what you're doing.
Great, thank you. Before we start to move on to some questions that I have, and I'm sure that you have, I just want to get a sense of who's in the audience. I'm just going to say a few categories, and if you could just raise your hand. Who here's a student? Great, about less than a quarter. Do we have any researchers? Very good. Administrators, school administrators? Yay, good, because we want to talk to you. And teachers? Wonderful, wonderful. Ed tech entrepreneurs or corporate? Good, good, that's a big chunk. Investors? None of those. Oh, we do. And so nonprofits or foundation folks? A few of those, very good. And media, other press? A few of those. And is there a category I didn't think? None of the above? Higher ed. I guess somehow teachers and administrators didn't fall into that. Great. There's other things that higher ed does that I still don't know about. Okay. And then I wanted to get a sense of why you're here. I mean, how many of you think this is the future of education and you want to know more about like student input in higher ed? How many of you think this is...
Almost everyone.
Yeah. How many of you just think this is completely stupid and you were looking for some ammunition to shoot this down and that, teachers know best? No, but okay, so we only have sympathizers here. It's like Fox TV talking to the Republicans. I mean, we're all in the same mindset here. How many of you are here to find a job? No, but okay, we're all employed, great. And I'm just wondering if there's another reason that, if there's one or two words that you could say, someone came here for a completely different reason. So you're following the cute guy here. Yeah, well, why did you come here, sir?
I just started a new elementary school and expanding into high school. That's very student-driven, student-led. And I actually started it
Great, great. Thank you. What, another reason, yes?
Policy implications for public university community college.
Fantastic, thank you. I just wanted to get a sense of your level of interest. I appreciate that. So the way we're going to do questions is we are not going to let people come to the microphone because from past experience, sometimes the questions go on too long and we don't get enough questions in. So we're going to set up a Twitter wall, and that'll come up now. If you have any questions for our panelists, I'm going to ask you to use the hashtag SXSWedU. And I'm told by the organizers this stands for South by Students and not what it looks like. So, and then anything you tweet under that hashtag will come on our Twitter wall. I'll be monitoring it here, and the most tweeted or the most favorited questions I'll ask are anything that looks particularly interesting to me. One of the things we really wanted to do with this session is make it a brainstorming session, and we want to come up with a list of ideas for college administrators for how they can bring more student input into the structure of their college. And so I'm going to be asking each of our panelists for their top idea, and I'm going to write it down. Please also tweet your ideas, and we're going to come up with a little list that I'll tweet out after the session so that we can all have a little list of ways to make colleges more student-driven. So we'll start with Dale, and tell me your top idea from your unconventional, outside the institution approach that you think any college could adopt.
The low-hanging fruit for how to become more self-directed is really easy. The first thing is to just actually ask for feedback. And you know, Alicia said that Minerva is doing this. This is not a revolutionary idea, but you have to ask for it, and you have to get the students to believe that you're actually going to take their feedback seriously and implement it, right? This is not hard. This is not rocket science. It's not a new idea. The other things are, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit around the science of pedagogy, right? We know that if you take a 5-minute break between studying, between two 20-minute study breaks, you'll retain twice the amount of information as if you didn't take the 5-minute break. Classes should be shorter with more breaks. Not hard. Logistically and operationally difficult, but the science is there, right? We know that the brain learns when synapses fire and wire together. You need personal context. People should constantly be asking themselves how what they're learning applies to their own life. Again, not rocket science, but if every professor was asking students to think about this question of how what they're learning applies to them every couple of minutes, and that was a prompt that they were actively thinking about and reflecting, they would have more personal investment in what they're doing. They would learn more efficiently. The outcomes would be higher, right? You know, these things are not difficult.
So the idea is every how many minutes?
So the study about taking breaks between learning.
No, that one. That was 20 minutes. You said to ask questions.
I mean, there's not a scientific study around what interval you should be asking the questions. But there's a lot of research around the fact that in order to learn, your brain needs personal context. It has to matter to you.
Got it. What would you say, Zach? What should every university do?
I was going to say what Dale said.
Really? Again, these things aren't very hard, right?
Well, what I would add is that, you know, whether it be at the K-12 experience or at higher ed level, there is a pretty significant structure for feedback. The problem with the existing structure is that that feedback comes at the end of the course, and the students never see the result of that feedback. So what does that feedback mean? And then again, to add to what Dale was saying about context, you know, we want to see the results of our feedback. We want the classroom to be more of a partnership between ourselves and our educators, and that I find to always be, and I know Minerva's doing this to an extent as well, I always find those classes to be the most engaging, the most exciting. I feel most connected with my professor when I feel like I have that partnership, and that's what feedback really does. It is so simple, but you know, I think it is just so, it is the low-hanging fruit.
Well, let me press you. Should we devote, if we're going to make shorter classes potentially, should we devote 5-10 minutes to every class?
Oh, we don't need to do this in class. They're online surveys. I mean,
online survey.
Like what Maryland does, for example, is at the end of every semester, you're I think it's 75% of students in every class need to submit their feedback to the professor in order for everyone to see the feedback that was given to that professor. But honestly, I never care to see the feedback that was given to that professor because I may never have that professor again. So what is that going to do for me? It may do for my other colleagues who take that professor in the future, but at the end of the day, it doesn't benefit me, so there isn't as much of an incentive.
But you would like an
Again,
online
personal
survey.
context,
You
right?
would like an online survey at the end of every class.
Well, I don't need, so I'll give one example of a K-12 teacher, Ryan Heisinger. He's a TFA Corps member in Newark, and after every single quarter, he will come into class at the end of the quarter. He'll give his students a survey in every single class. The next day, he'll go home. He'll calculate the results of those surveys, and he'll come into class the following day and discuss the results of those surveys with his students. Now, at the K-12 level, there are more days, more hours with your students, so it makes it a little bit easier. But with online capabilities these days, it's not that hard to at least do a part of that and help students see what their peers are saying, and then obviously have an online conversation around what could be better. It doesn't need to be long. Could it be a half an hour once, after every exam? It's not that complex, but at least it does something to move the class forward and help improve it.
Great. Alicia?
Yeah, I think like Dale's saying, these concepts aren't new. They're not revolutionary. A lot of them also aren't difficult to understand or even to implement. And I think to take my example of doing feedback surveys after every class, I think that it's not a very glamorous, groundbreaking idea to fill in a survey, but I think maybe what is the more groundbreaking bit is that the surveys are actually very carefully read, discussed afterwards, and changes are actually implemented based off of what we said. And the survey is really just the starting point. So I gave that example because it's a daily thing. It happens 2 or 3 times a day. But then after that, the other pieces that happen, and this is kind of my suggestion, I think, is these other frameworks and structures that you need, which helps you to add personal context as well to your feedback. So these can be things like we have a student feedback committee. So this committee really will gather all the thoughts of students and collect it in a way so as to generate consensus. And we'll meet with the academic team on a weekly basis about these things. Or we also have larger town halls, which are monthly meetings where all of the faculty and students come together. And we discuss some of the things that maybe some of the pain points or some of the things that we're trying to work through. And this is really a way to bring the survey and the feedback to life. And it's really about having this collaborative, ongoing process. It's very much not just us typing in and it just kind of being sent off somewhere. But I mean, that's why we give feedback, because we know that somebody's actually listening on the other end and that there's this dialogue afterwards.
So I think what you're alluding to is that at a much higher level, the governance structure of most universities is not built in such a way that the incentives of the students are aligned with the incentives of the teacher, are aligned with the incentives of the administrators. So it's really hard to actually implement these low-level changes if the governance structure is in such a way that teachers are rewarded for doing academic research that has nothing to do with teaching, and the administrators are being tied to a board who wants them to build more aquatic complexes so they can look fancier and get higher up in rankings, right? I'm really interested in thinking about really far-flung governance models. Why don't we have universities that are co-ops, that are like for-purpose corporations that are actually owned by students?
Yeah, and I think like
I like that.
Well, actually, one of the first universities in Italy was basically exactly what you're describing. But what I would add is that we don't necessarily need to change the role of the professor or change the role of the student within the university to actually create a better student-driven learning experience here. When I talked about how I love how my real-world experiences complement my in-the-classroom experiences, it's so frustrating with how difficult it is to actually get credit for the experiences I have outside of the classroom. And I think that shouldn't be the case. You deserve credit for what you do outside of the classroom. And there can be a structured environment. I mean, independent studies are nice, but why is there a limit on the amount of independent studies that I can do necessarily? I know Goddard College allows students to basically go out there and do whatever it is that they want, have the experiences that they have, and then come back and work with an advisor to put it in some academic context. Yeah. Now that's the extreme example, but encouraging students to take more independent studies allows them to then find more purpose when they interact with their professors in actually figuring out how what they're learning applies to the real world. And that's what I have going on right now. I actually based my current independent study on the late David Carr's course at New York Times journalist at BU, and I'm working with one of my professors at the University of Maryland to actually figure out how what's going on in the journalism field and the media field applies to some of the academic studies that have taken place, and it's helping me glean a better understanding for the future of media and also the past as well. So the complement of real world, what's happening now with the academic context makes it a much more valuable learning experience for me.
So we have a question that intrigues me and has a few retweets and favorites as well. This panel is very self-actualized and informed. How do their organizations reach out to underserved communities? And I mean, and another way of elaborating on this also is that you are all very self-directed students, and it's one thing for self-directed students to be directing their own education when you have a passion for something that you want to learn, or you know what you want to learn. For students that don't have your foundations, is this the right? I mean, should we listen to the way they want to learn? And do they know enough?
One of my so when we look at some of the underserved students, part of the solution that we come up with is there's no structure in the home life. There's no structure outside of school. So we need to provide all of this structure within school. And then we just do it year after year after year after year without gradually providing them with more independence and opportunity to explore and so on and so forth. And I think there is the opportunity to really build in significant structure, which is really needed with the massive, the highest attrition rates that we've seen in university history. There is a need for more structure in the early years, but why don't we build in more independence later on? I don't see that opportunity. And then, now we have also one of the highest youth unemployment rates for people with a bachelor's degree under the age of 25. And I think that says something as well, because we're not giving these students the independence to maybe even create their own jobs thereafter. I believe that everyone has the opportunity to be as self-serving and independent as we are, if given the context and the structure to learn how to be that.
Dale?
I have tons of opinions on this. So when I went out to write my book, everyone said, oh, you're only going to find privileged, white, cisgendered males who are going to be self-directed. And I was totally blown away and proven wrong. Because there were a lot of people that I found who had become self-directed by necessity, who had chosen not to go to college because college was too expensive and they didn't know how to pay for it, and had taken the path because there was no other option, right? Who were women of color, who grew up in India and ended up being the first captain of an oil tank, of the youngest captain of an oil tanker in the world. I was really blown away about how many people were self-directed by necessity, not by choice. I think that, and it's absolutely true that we, at least on college, has a much harder time reaching out to underserved students because of current governance and funding models, right? It blows me away that any random 18-year-old can walk into a bank and get a huge loan to get an art history degree with unemployment rates under 25 of graduates out of control, and yet programs like ours and General Assembly and Dev Bootcamp that have demonstrated outcomes and are unaccredited, you can barely get loans for, right? It's mind-boggling that why should we fund someone to go get an art history degree with super low unemployment chances, where 85% of our students are employed in the first year of in the field they were pursuing. If we fix that, we can fix the underserved question a lot easier.
One of the things that strikes me about this conversation about student-built or student-directed learning is that we should make students happy on campuses, almost like consumers of Pepsi. Make sure that they're drinking what they want to be drinking and that they're happy and drinking more of it. And I wonder if there's something unique about learning that we shouldn't always listen to students. I was talking with a researcher who saw a study about feedback. He was trying to figure out what kinds of feedback are most effective. And it turned out that when students were given 3 or 4 different kinds of feedback, when they were given oblique hints, the students said they didn't like that kind of feedback. What they really liked, what they clicked on, was I like the spoon-fed feedback, the kind of feedback that required the least thinking and the least learning on the part of the student. And so I wonder, should we trust students to know what they want and give them what they want, and what limits we should put on that? Like when do we listen to the student and when do we not listen to the student? And I think this is something that you've been struggling with at Minerva. And can you give us an example of when the students wanted something and the university said no?
Yeah, well, I think first I want to emphasize, also with your previous question, that I think student-directed doesn't need to be entirely built and led by the student alone. I think there are many cases where that does happen, but I think student-directed in many ways can also just mean that it's directed for the benefit of the students or for the best interests of the students. And that direction and that design can be by the faculty and the staff. And I think this is something that we really do. Our curriculum isn't built from the ground up by students. It's built by experts who have been to top institutions. They've been studying the science of learning and how the brain works for decades. And they're the ones that have really put together this curriculum. And we can definitely think critically and ask questions about it and work with them to refine elements of it. But I also think that none of us are arrogant enough to think that we could have built this by ourselves or that we know better than them and that we've built up the same amount of wisdom as they have over their years. And I think that distinction is really important to me because self-directed for us really means that we can continually think about what are our interests and they think about that as well.
Give me some feedback that the students gave, the administration said no way.
Sure. I think that the no way piece isn't like a hard no. So the first example I'm thinking of is that our schedule this semester is actually very different from the way it was last semester. And I think part of that was because it was more designed to initially cater for the ease of the faculty because they were teaching 2 classes in a row, so we had breaks in between, and so sometimes our classes would end 4 or 5 p.m. And it was difficult for us to really get out into the city. And so that was something we realized quite early on, and we wanted to change it, and we gave feedback on that. But then I think there's also a lot of value, and this touches on your other point, in kind of working through that, and rather than just changing things immediately, actually figuring out what the value of both alternatives could be. And so that's why we ended up listening to our professors and our staff and testing out with that schedule for the first semester, and then only changing it starting this semester. Because we definitely have a voice, and we have all this shaping to do, but we also don't in any way expect or want for us to just say something and then there's a change
So you guys asked to go like touring at 4 and 5 p.m. and the faculty said no, you actually have to study?
No, it wasn't like that. We just asked for our classes to be put together more in the morning so that we would have more freedom to design our
And they said no, your guys are actually going to study in the afternoon too.
We still study in the afternoon, it's just that now we have the freedom to kind of just like schedule our days by ourselves a little bit more.
Right. So I'm looking at some questions here. You guys can't see the Twitter wall, can you?
I can read it.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, you can. You have good enough eyes for that. Is there one that's been catching your attention, Dale, that you wanted to?
I've been seeing a lot of commentary on what do we do with these unmotivated students, and I think that there's an assumption that students are by default unmotivated, and I think that's totally wrong. If you actually take the time to ask students what they're interested in, you can find something that they're excited about. And one of the things that we've done, and I'm seeing a lot of comments on, what can administrators do and take away, is that we've developed a coaching model so that every student meets with a coach on a weekly basis to help them contextualize information, set goals, keep them accountable, connect them to resources and mentors, so that they can take whatever curriculum they're working on and apply it to themselves and figure out what that particular student is motivated to do.
So Zach, when you're building your own major, or anyone's building his own major, I have 2 questions. What one protects you against making some bad decisions? Like what if you decide that physics for poets is really a good part of a major on engagement? Sure. And how do we ensure that you learn a discipline deeply? One of the things that I've noticed about students creating their own majors is they tend to be interdisciplinary. This happened at Brown, where I went to school. And I always had the impression that they weren't learning anything deeply and they weren't learning foundations. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't learn deeply anymore.
Well, so I actually, just to tie it into one of the questions I saw, I think it was Daniel Cow asked, how do we balance this idea of professors and mentors pushing students to do more and be better with the idea of self-directed learning? And that's what I've had a lot of. Actually, so for the major I created, I was required to have a faculty mentor in the process of creating that major. And through that process, I said to one of the people in the individual studies program where I can create my own major, I have never been pushed more by a professor and challenged more to be better than I have been by my faculty mentor. she would not stand for me having any of those obscure classes within a major that seemed somewhat irrelevant. And so that was a really valuable component. I have a mentor, I have someone who's pushing me, but also helping me put everything in an academic context. And so I think I chose the right faculty mentor.
So if I can interrupt
sure.
you right there, I mean, that's great. You're one of 25 students at University of Maryland.
Roughly.
You have got, sorry?
Roughly.
Roughly,
Yeah.
that's doing their own major. I mean, imagine as you're trying to encourage hundreds of students to design their own major, could we really have hundreds of faculty working with individual students, pushing them this much?
Well, it's not for everybody, number one. And I think that's important to note. I mean, a lot of the majors that already exist, like if you want to go into finance, I don't know what the point of an individual studies program really would be necessarily. Maybe there is a way to create that experience, but
I think the turnkey thing here is that you have to turn every student into a teacher, right? The way to scale this is that the seniors are doing most of the mentoring of the freshmen, right? And so everyone along the process, as you get better, you're teaching the person who just learned what you learned. Because as someone who just learned something, you're actually probably in a better position to teach it because you just learned it than someone who learned it 20 years ago.
I mean, it's all relative to what you're trying to learn and the experience you're trying to have. I definitely appreciate the opportunity to learn with folks who are going through who have recently gone through a similar experience. But that's not to say that, like, you know, David Carr, just alone, without even meeting me in person, taught me so much just through his syllabus. Like, that was incredible, how much I learned through him. So, I mean, yeah, it's nice. I think the idea of having younger people mentor their fellow students might be more applicable to those who may not yet be prepared for that self-directed learning experience and need to be exposed to it by a peer, someone else who, you know, recently went through a similar transition in figuring out how to learn on their own. And that's exactly how I described it earlier. I discovered this create your own major project through a senior. So it has relevance, but I wouldn't say it's imperative for everybody either.
There's a great question on this line of thought from the audience. How do you know what you need to learn? What if you miss something?
Knowing what you don't know is arguably one of the most important skills, right? When you're on a job, someone says, I need you to understand the manufacturing process for cardboard products in Malaysia. You don't necessarily know what that is. The key skill is knowing who to ask for help, what the right questions are, when to stop. You know, all of these meta questions around how to learn that are, I think, the most important thing about learning.
Yeah, and I think that that's where it's really important to look at how to learn before you learn what to learn. And that's why you really need these tools and these skills and habits of mind, which is really what we focus on in the freshman year. And then after that is when you start to focus more on content. So in the first year, the content is really a vehicle to develop these skills. And these skills are the ones that help you to ask the right questions and kind of gives you a framework from which to go by. And really what mastery is for these skills is when you can take them and apply them to a completely novel context. And that part might be more self-directed, but this core is still something that we're...
So what if I can interrupt for a second, what if you decide, I want to study physics, but you know what, quantum mechanics, no thank you. And like that's the way you decide you want to pursue physics.
Yeah, I mean, the first year isn't, so the skills aren't like quantum mechanics and physics, obviously. They're very broken down. They're divided into 4 cornerstones.
No, I mean when you go on and you decide what you want to specialize in, say you want to become a physicist, and you decide, you fill in your content, right, as you go on and decide. I mean, you can decide not to do the quantum part?
I mean, I guess that's a very specific example.
I mean, this is where the market comes in, right? You have to make a choice of, if you're going to be a physicist, then you probably have to learn quantum mechanics. Or you can make an alternative choice to go and say, okay, I'm going to take what I learned about physics and apply it to online marketing and go work at Facebook, right? Like.
Yeah, and this is maybe where, I don't think like self-directed means you figure out every single thing that you need to know and you decide what you don't need. I think there still is an element of actually, working with mentors or advisors or working with the curriculum as well, which is really important to have as the core of your education.
Zach, you think the kids should decide, or the students should decide the content?
I think that students should be a part of that process. I don't think students are necessarily, I mean, look, I didn't determine my own content from even my own independent study. I basically based it off of the syllabus of David Carr and my professor's recommendations and others. And I valued that, and I think that a great part of this self-directed learning experience is finding purpose and having curiosity. And I'm not expecting every student to necessarily have that right away. They need to be guided in that direction. And so when we look at this at scale, this idea of self-directed learning. I think really what we're looking at now and what the difference is between the 1960s and here is that we have choice in terms of the options we have in higher education. You have the colleges of the world, you have the Goddard colleges, you have the Minervas, you have the traditional universities like I'm going to. NYU has a whole school, the Gallatin School, that allows students to create their own majors. Now, from my experience now that I'm in both schools in some capacity, I find that Maryland really encourages you to really have real purpose and relevancy and academic purpose, but also career purpose in choosing your own major. Whereas Gallatin, like I can major in zebras and that could be approved. Not to discredit it, I think it's a learning opportunity, and that's what Gallatin really provides you with, whereas Maryland is maybe a little more career focused.
So I want to take a step back and also recognize that learning is just one part of the college experience, and arguably it's part of the college experience that colleges do least well and is also least important, right? There's a huge part of the college experience that's about making friends, living on your own, learning to do your laundry, having sex for the first time, learning how many beers you can drink before you get a hangover. Like, these are all really important parts of being an adult, and I think we gloss over them entirely when we think about what the purpose of a higher education is.
And explain the importance of that in our discussion right
now. I think the importance of that is that colleges need to decide, are they a rite of passage for adults to adulthood, or do they really care about learning, right? What I see Uncollege doing is that we help people learn how to learn, but most importantly, we help young people become adults. We help them understand who they are, how they learn, and what they want to do. And then typically, after our program, they'll go off and do a General Assembly, they'll go to Minerva, they'll go to a place that actually teaches hard skills, right? And I think that we're at this point where, as college is being disaggregated, colleges need to decide, are they a rite of passage to adulthood, or do they really care about learning?
So I'm curious, am I not really prepared to be an adult because I went to Maryland?
I really don't see how learning and preparing for adulthood need to be two separate pieces. I think one important piece is that it's preparation for personal, professional success. It's also intellect development, but also social development. And I think a big part of that is being exposed to different types of people, different places. So one of the things we do, like I mentioned before, is that we'll study in a different city each semester, which is definitely much more challenging than being isolated on a campus for 4 years somewhere. And I think Uncollege does this as well. There's an element of going out and exploring. And I think that's really important as well for social development and this adulthood process that you're talking about.
The idea that I'm positing is that what we've seen is this rise of skill-centric education, right? The General Assembly, Dev boot camps of the world that have perfected how to teach a hard skill in 3 months. And colleges ostensibly do both of these things, and they do an okay job of it, right? They don't really focus on either of them in an intentional way, and yet learning how to learn and learning how to be an adult are what every adult says they learned at college, yet they were actually never explicitly taught it. So what I'm positing is that as we see these hard skills being taught and people explicitly learning how to learn, we're going to see a rise of programs that explicitly focus on helping people become adults.
So what I think, to add to your point, or to kind of complement it in some way, is that for me with Maryland, I felt like I maxed out on my experience as a growing young adult by being there for 2 years. After 2 years, like I knew I needed to be there and I had a purpose and I value it, but I needed.
You must have done a lot of celebration.
Maryland was. I'm a New Yorker, and so in Maryland was a different atmosphere for me, and so it was time for me to go somewhere else. It was time for me to go to New York. So my point in saying that is that I think Uncollege and the Minervas of the world provide people with opportunities to grow in different ways because we all grow in different ways. Mm-hmm. And I think the real point of this panel is to emphasize that we need to build in more self-directed learning opportunities for students and support them and encourage them to pursue those when they're ready and when they feel like they're ready, and push them to do so. But at the same time, helping students understand that there are options out there beyond the traditional system and starting to value those in a way that parallels that of Ivy League institutions, parallels that of starting your own company and whatnot. These are all valuable experiences, and I'm not saying every student is equipped for all or even most of those, but let's help students find the right one for them, and that's really important.
So how does the university establish some sort of quality control to make sure that the decisions that students are making for themselves academically are legitimate
It's just
good
like
ones?
K-12. We need better school counseling. We need more, we need more school counseling options.
Coaching?
Whether it be within the institutions or outside. Ideally, they be within the institutions.
So we'd have life coaches at all these?
Well, we need life coaches. I mean, school is a centerpiece of a student's life, right? I mean, if you're a full-time student, that's your life. So at that point in life, in some way, they are maybe a life coach in a certain regard, but I don't really think of them as that. They're school counselors, and that's what the school counselor profession is, and I think we need to begin to invest in and value that much more than we do. It serves a purpose when done right, but also is counterintuitive when it really is just there to help you register for classes when a computer can do that just as well. And I've had amazing school counselors, but at times I don't think they've been provided with. They need more. We need more school counselors, because when a school counselor has a couple hundred
students,
how are they going to invest in one student? We need more of those. And you know what? Actually, that also ties into the idea that Dale had about, I think it was you, Dale, about having older students mentor younger students. Older graduate students and whatnot can also support these counselors in this process of mentoring students. If there was someone else who studied something remotely close to what I studied, they could help guide me through my self-directed learning experience. So we don't necessarily even need to invest so much more money in this, but we need to create an infrastructure where there are more school counseling opportunities for students to access.
But so I'm wondering, can a teacher not serve as a form of a life coach? Because I think what you're
100%.
touching on before is really important with, developing other types of skills and preparing for adulthood. And I don't see why your curriculum can't do that. The skills that we're really looking at, there's these 4 different sectors or buckets that we have. So it's critical thinking, creative thinking, effective communication, and effective interaction. And this isn't just the kind of skills that you need to do well on a test or succeed in academia, but it's the kinds of skills that you need in anything. And these are the kinds of things that you need to be a good adult, really. And so I think that's where, if the teacher is really guiding your learning and has your best interests in mind, and there's no friction of whether it's for the professor's research or if it's for the student's learning, I think if there's always that common goal of keeping students in the heart of the institution, then all of this can be accomplished, I think, through the structures that we have, but if they're implemented in a better way.
Can this work at a large publicly funded university with 20,000 students?
I go to a large public university.
Right, but there's only 25 of you or so doing it.
But I think that's because the program hasn't been advertised well, and I think if there were not many more resources put into just supporting this program, it's feasible. I mean, at NYU, again, there's the Gallatin School, there's a department there, and I don't have the number of students there, but there are definitely a couple hundred students, if not a couple thousand students, who've gone through that program for years, so it's feasible within a school. I think we just need to iterate on the experience, on that self-directed learning experience and make it better.
I think the governance model is going to have to change, right? And I think what Minerva and what I essentially do for all of you is serve as forcing functions to say, if you guys don't change, you're going to die, right? Like Sweetbriar just closed last week. IAB just gave themselves to the University of Iowa. These institutions are large, they're slow, they're encumbered. And I don't know necessarily if I'm going to be around in 20 years. Maybe the system will be able to move fast enough to adopt all of the principles and actually be self-directed so that I don't need to exist anymore. That'd be great. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's a possibility, and it's an outcome that I would be happy with, right? I'm seeing a lot of questions about relevance, and I think what Alicia said answers that question exactly. What's relevant is what the market values, right? The skills that Alicia just outlined, if you look at any of the reports that Bain and McKinsey and the College Board do about what employers want and aren't valued, those 5 things that Alicia just listed off, that's what's on there, right?
Yeah, and I think it's definitely very important to keep this in mind, and I think that your curriculum needs to address these things, right? And that's why if you start with these core elements, then that's a way of addressing it from the onset. And as well, I think sort of a big test of whether or not these kinds of programs are working is how we're received by the workforce. And so one thing that Minerva does is goes to employers and asks them, what are you looking for? What kinds of interns or employees do you need? And then actually builds these skills off of that. So there definitely needs to be this resonance between the two.
What if you want to be a doctor? I mean, are you going to have a student-directed pre-med program?
So let me flip that question. Say you go in for surgery, and you find out that the doctor that was supposed to do it is out that day. And you're given a choice of having the nurse who's been assisting with surgeries for 10 years do the operation, or the person who's straight out of medical school. I'd take the nurse, personally. right? Like, there's a lot of value in practical experience. And I'm not suggesting that we should redo how board exams and doctor's certifications are done, but there's a lot of value in actually having done the thing that you're going to do. And if you specialize in doing that lung surgery, like, I would any day take the nurse who's done it 300 times over the med student who's maybe watched it once.
I'd like to find another doctor who,
Well, yes, ideally, but.
That too. But I think maybe to your question, I mean, I think these extreme forms, like Uncollege, of self-directed learning, they're not for everyone. Like, any of our 3 organizations are not for everyone, but I think there's definitely elements that are. That's why I think it's cool, that we're putting together this list of suggestions and talking about these various elements. Because I think if you want to be a doctor, you definitely want people to feel comfortable in your experiences and your competencies, and you can't just build all of that yourself.
Right. Well, it seems to work a bit better for engagement in media studies, perhaps, than in biochem. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that strikes me about this conversation is generational changes. I mean, I'm quite a bit older than these fellow panelists, and I think they grew up in a generation where they lived in families where they got a say on what restaurant they went to dinner, which is not something I got a say in my household. And so it's quite natural, I think, that they feel that they get a stronger say in their education. And I'm personally much more comfortable with a legendary professor who's a benevolent dictator, and just sort of happy to put myself in his hands and teach me the discipline that he knows so well, or she knows so well. And it's interesting that students today, understandably, aren't happy with that. I mean, my own daughter she's the boss, and she gets to decide things. And I'm sure when she gets to college, she's going to think that, she knows what she wants to learn, and, these prerequisites, she'll take some and she'll pass some up. Thank you very much for your time today. Please continue to tweet if you think of a suggestion. I'm going to compile a list of a half dozen of these, and I'll make a Google Doc of it, and I'll tweet it out again under the SX students hashtag. Thank you.
awesome.